I cannot believe it's October. It is October 22nd. I mean, I feel like, is it going to be Thanksgiving in like 5 minutes? I feel like it might be. But it's October. This is our live Q&A call. So let's start out with if you have any specific questions. And tell me if you're a nurse, physician, neurologist, therapist, just interested person, what is your role in the NICU? And then also I'd love to know, what is your role in your role, what do you do related to aEEG interpretation? So, and what are some of the challenges that you have around aEEG interpretation? So anybody want to be brave while I take a sip of my tea? So many times I travel and I find that nurses are not reading the aEEG. They'll get the leads on, they'll maintain them, they'll reposition them, they'll check impedance, but that when it comes to the actual tracing, they're not feeling super confident and not really harnessing the power of what the aEEG can offer us at the bedside. And I see this trend too of kind of outsourcing that to neurology and to other people, that when we have full video EEG, we think we don't need aEEG. And I think that that's not true as well. I feel like we need to remind ourselves that that trend is helpful to neurologists, that's helpful to us at the bedside. And if you don't know what your hospital policy is on review, so few of us have access to 24/7 in-house telemetry type services where aEEG is being reviewed nonstop. We need to use the bedside trend to help us. So anyways, anybody want to share with me kind of what you guys are doing in your units and what some of the challenges are of reading aEEG? Because that's what we're going to talk about today. I guess I should double check you guys can hear me okay. It says my little mic is going, so. All right.
Kathy, it's Ann.
Hi, Ann.
Hi. I just wanted to let you know, yes, it's working. We can hear you.
Great. Any comments about what I had mentioned around interpretation?
I know that at our hospital, we are reading the EEG when we're at the bedside, that we're charting on that every hour, and we're the ones to put on the monitors and put on the, check the impedance, and we are actually charting what we are seeing.
Great.
Although we don't go as far as to say like continuous normal voltage, we'll say we're above 5, above 10.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, and I think that as a nurse, those are, if we think of the aEEG as a vital sign and that there are numeric values, we can record that just like we record every other numeric value that comes by, and we trend that just like we trend everything else, and we can see that. But I think, aEEG is quite nice in that we have a nice visual trend, I think, but that process of looking, evaluating, and writing kind of puts us in touch with, is that up or is that down? Is it not? But yeah, no, I'm glad to hear that. That's actually exactly what I recommend. Everyone does that.
So I do have one challenge. The last time I put it on, I totally started the AEG, and I put in the baby's name, and I was using the Olympic Brains monitor. And it seemed like I got everything in, everything hooked up, and then when I got to the main screen to start recording, like nothing was going on, and I was trying to figure out, I was like, okay, I know this is a compression, but I would have thought my impedance would have been showing immediately. And
yeah,
so that's not the monitor, that was me.
That sounds like the monitor, not you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, usually when you plug that one in, I think it goes through a little self-test.
Yeah.
That amplifier, the little box where you plug the electrodes in, it can easily get disconnected. It's just a USB connection. So just like your phone can get disconnected from its charger thing, it can get disconnected or have a poor connection in the back. So sometimes wiggling that or taking that out and putting it back in. But it should have told you that it doesn't have a signal, and that amplifier is pretty sensitive. It will give you, some of the older ones will just read like dashed lines. If it was if the impedance was high, but I think you guys use needles, right?
We do, yes.
Yeah, so you would have low impedance, so it wouldn't really be that situation. But yeah, the impedance should have shown up on that screen. And certainly, yeah, the aEEG takes 5 or 10 minutes before you start to really see much emerging from that right-hand margin. But
right.
you've seen something on the, and you should have seen something in the EEG, right, in the actual raw trace, and you should have seen the numeric values. That's odd.
Yeah, it went through a self-test a few times, and I'm like, oh man, I hope I don't have to go get a new monitor. I just put it on.
Yeah, well, you can always just
did start working.
Oh, it did. Yeah, you can always just disconnect the electrodes and switch the monitor out. You don't have to redo your electrodes. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it sounds like a machine problem.
Okay.
I would send it
back
away.
To mute.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks. It's a good question. It happens a lot. So, all right. So what I was going to go over today are 5 questions to assess aEEG. And so these are just things that I sometimes teach when trying to get people first acquainted with it, but I thought it might be a nice review. If any of you are struggling with aEEG interpretation, thinking about expanding the role of the nurse related to aEEG assessment, I thought it might be helpful. So the first question that we need to ask is about the upper margin of aEEG. And so remembering that each single line of aEEG is 15 seconds. So if I can get my mouse here. So each single line represents the maximum and minimum voltages for 15 seconds. And we remember that the aEEG band here, this is divided left and right on this particular screenshot. And we have 0 at the baseline, 5, then 10 is halfway up. And then the other halfway from 10 to 100 is the logarithmic section. So it's really difficult to assign a specific numerical value. We just say it's greater than 10. Sometimes we have some of the screenshots I'll show you have 25 and 50. So sometimes we can say greater than 25 or greater than 50. And sometimes we even say greater than 100. But what we're doing is we're kind of looking for the thickest part of the band. And we can take into account these small spikes. They're mostly artifact in a situation like this where the voltage is very low. But what we're looking for with the upper margin is to really name this as low voltage or normal voltage or bursting. So the upper margin is that maximum voltage that the electrodes have picked up. And the first question, we can start with the worst and move forward, is it even above 5? And in this situation, when we look at the thickest part, there are some moments that we reach above 5, but for the most part, the majority of this tracing is all less than 5. When it is less than 5, then we know that this is a flat trace. Most of the time, we're going to get a yes to that answer. But if it is not above 5, this is where we have our inactive patterns. So I have just drawn some of these lines to just kind of indicate 5, depending on how big your screen is. So if the answer is no, then you have an inactive or a flat aEEG pattern. And although this can be, the baby can actually have minimal brain activity, more commonly there's some sort of electrode issue. Either an electrode has fallen off or an electrode is touching. So when you use hydrogels, or peel and stick, or even cups and discs, this is oftentimes what a pattern will look like if you've canceled your electrodes out. But certainly there are catastrophic moments that result in a pattern, an EEG pattern, the amount of brain activity that is quite low. So starting with that upper margin, we're basically just trying to rule out patterns by looking at the maximum voltages. So next we would say, again, is it above 5? Yes. But in this case, is it even above 10? And so here we have our 10 mark, and this voltage for this pattern is not even reaching 10. An occasional spike here and there. Again, remembering that the gray horizontal lines or the hash marks at the bottom of your screen, or however your screen is designated with time markers, pretty much 1 centimeter is 10 minutes, or 6 centimeters for an hour. So we're looking at the overall brain activity, and we're saying, is the upper margin even hitting 10? And if the answer is yes, then we're very happy. That's a more normal range. But if it's not, then we're calling that low voltage. So the upper margin is really helping us with voltage. And then the lower margin is going to be really that where we get into the continuity. So we'll be doing that next. So is it above 5? Yes. Yay. Is it above 10? No. This one is a low voltage pattern. So again, in this situation, we're looking at that. Is the upper margin above our 5? Yes. Is the upper margin above our 10? Yes. Periodically, right? So we're looking at the best parts and we see that it is over 10. And even when it dips down, it's right at that 10 level. So we're saying yes, it is. And in that case, it is, oops, sorry, I'm rolling backwards. It is a normal pattern. So again, greater than 10 and having this nice fluctuations, that is normal. What about when it is greater than 5 and greater than 10 and greater than 25? So here again, we have our 0, our 5, our 10. This particular monitor gives 25, 50, and 100. So it's still the same marks or same pattern or scale, but it's just marked out a little bit better. And here's our 25 mark. And now we see that, yes, there are some spikes that are reaching above 25. And in that case, now we're looking more at bursts. It's not low voltage. It's not normal voltage, it's bursting voltage. So that upper edge kind of helps give you a clue towards which pattern you're going to. So there are times when this could just be an extremely preterm baby, and they will also generate very, very high voltages. This is where it's important to know your gestational age and the why. Remember, always talk about why am I monitoring? What am I looking for? Because it will give you an idea whether or not this is expected or not. But when we see things above 25 microvolts, those are electrical bursts. So whether it's bursting because I'm immature and I can't regulate my activity well, or if it's a burst because I have many broken neurons and they're just bursting out abnormal activity, anything that's bursting up above 25 should be something to be keeping an eye on and finding an explanation for. So upper margin, we always think of, is it greater than 5? Is it greater than 10? And is it greater than 25? And so kind of going through them in that order. Then we're going to assess the lower margin. The lower margin is how low can you go, right? Kind of like limbo, right? Like how low can you go? How low does that brain activity get? And it's actually the lower margin is actually a calculation of the difference between the lowest voltage in the last 15 seconds and the lowest voltage in this 15 seconds. And if it keeps going, it gets lower and lower and lower and lower till it gets flat, and then it will come back up if there's some activity. So this is all about continuous activity versus discontinuous activity or breaks in activity. So the lower margin talks to us about continuous or discontinuous. So for that, we're looking at 5. So remember, the scale is always 0, 5, 10, halfway up, and then the rest of it, the other half goes to 100. So now we're concerning ourselves with just that lower margin, and is that lower margin above 5? So if it's above 5, then yay, it's a continuously active pattern, so we call it continuous. If it's not, if the lower margin is below 5, then we consider that discontinuous pattern, meaning that there's not absence of activity, it's just that there is inconsistent activity or discontinuous activity. So that lower margin just is that indication of the continuity or the continuousness of activity. So upper margin is all about normal or abnormal voltage. The lower margin is all around continuity, continuous or discontinuous. So that's when we say discontinuous normal voltage, that's how that that wording comes together. Lower margin is less than 5, discontinuous, but normal voltage, meaning that the upper margin still hits above 10. And that's where that comes from. Continuous low continuous low voltage, that lower margin is still low. It's lower than 5. That's kind of like the outlier one. It's all continuous, but it's all less than 10. And that's where those words really do go back to what you can see on the pattern. And then continuous normal voltage, you've got continuous, the lower margins above 5, and normal, the upper margins above 10. So kind of thinking of it that way. So the next thing I want you to think about is there variability? This is important for maturation. This is important for health. And so what we're looking for is just variability. So not that everything is the same. That's really what we're looking for. And when we see that baseline variability, it can be either continuous or discontinuous, but it really is, it is that variability that sets it apart from when we don't see any of that variability. Then we're talking about burst suppression. So burst suppression tends to have the very low, flat baseline, but we also see that low, flat baseline when there's an artifact. So if you can think of heart rate, right? Very consistent, very consistent, very consistent. High frequency, very consistent, very consistent, very consistent. That's gonna cause a drift in your baseline to be elevated and to look really flat, because that artifact comes in and is just always equal. And so there's none of that variability that we should see in a normal brain. So even in a discontinuous pattern like this one, it's still, there's variability. When we start to get a sick brain, the baseline variability goes away. It goes burst and flat, burst and flat, burst and flat. That variability at the baseline becomes very, very flat. But we can also be faked out when there is, like this, a drift in the baseline, but it's also very low and flat. That's from artifact. We see this a lot, this artifact that bumps us up, causes this very flat baseline, and it becomes almost impossible to really know what is the voltage of the brain. We can lean on our pattern recognition and still call this burst suppression because we see that it's over 25 and it has a very low, flat baseline. But it's hard to know. It kind of makes it a little more confusing when that artifact gets in the way. So variability at the baseline is really that thing that kind of pushes you towards burst suppression or a discontinuous, excessively discontinuous pattern for like a very, very small baby. Here's another example where that baseline just gets pushed up, and because that artifact is all the same, this is another high frequency, you just see kind of this flattened out pattern there. Number 4 question to ask yourself. So first we did the upper margin, lower margin, and then we looked for variability. Next is if we see regular cycling. So cycling is very important. It's that indication that the brain is actually cycling through patterns, and we want to see that until our babies are 44 weeks. We should see it, and then they transition into other kinds of cycling patterns. But babies should cycle between continuous and discontinuous, and what we're looking for is one dip down into discontinuous every hour while they're resting. And if we don't see that, then we should wonder about the maturation of the brain, the health of the brain, and whether or not it's organizing well. So I like to look through for regular cycling, and again, about one dip down per hour. So here we have a dip down that lasts around 10, 20, 35-ish minutes. And then we have one here that lasts 10, 20, 30, 40-ish minutes. So these are really nice, mature sleep-wake cycles. Often in the NICU, we don't see that. We oftentimes see shortened one, we see interrupted cycling, but just that attempt for the brain to cycle about once every hour is always a good sign. So that's what I'm looking for. And then the 5th piece, of course, is we're always wanting to look for uprisings or areas that may be questionable for seizures, or there may be questionable for artifacts and things that we can remove and to clean up our tracing. So of course, We're looking at that upper margin. We're looking at the lower margin. We're looking for that variability. We're looking for those places that are getting wider and dipping down. But then we're also now looking for these uprisings. And this is a great example of a baby in status where we have an uprising that starts here around 11:30. Then it has a little short one, and then a bigger one, and then we have some others. And then right here, right before 12:07, the red marker is opened up and expanded, and we see that there is this very powerful spike wave repetitive pattern that is very indicative of seizures. And so looking for these uprisings and then drawing someone's attention to them who can help you to navigate through the device depending on your role. So looking for these things can give you kind of a nice systematic way to look for that. But we also may see interruptions and uprisings. Again, these very flattened ones, like over here, see that very flat baseline. I thought these are great examples of muscle artifact. This is a baby crying for 15 minutes. That's what that is. So muscle artifact, if we have our electrodes here, baby's crying, sucking, those kinds of things, grimacing, we may oftentimes pick those up depending on where your electrodes are. So putting our electrodes here, making sure we put them high enough on the baby's head is always quite helpful. But when we find these uprisings, just like we did on the other screen, we still need to go investigate what they are. So we open them up by putting our cursor there. Depending on what kind of device you have, you might just touch the screen. Some other monitors, you might have to double click with a mouse. But by opening that up, you can evaluate whether or not you see a nice clean tracing, spike wave pattern, or in this case, you see this muscle artifact that is contaminating your pattern. Yes, we still have an upper margin above 10. We have mostly in the lower margin kind of below 5. We don't really see sleep-wake cycling. We see variability, but we have these uprisings, so they're concerning. Obviously, you're monitoring a baby for some reason. So these areas are actually artifact and not, in fact, a true seizure. So these are my 5 questions. Assess the upper margin. Assess the lower margin. Look for that baseline variability, changing variability, looking for those cycling, and then looking for those uprisings. And this will cover the major features of aEEG. Your background, how strong is your brain, how continuously active is your brain, whether or not you have variability, which is healthy and what we want to see, even in our smallest babies, 22, 23, 24 weekers, should show variability. They'll show low continuity. Their lower margin will be very low. Their brain isn't very mature, so their upper margin will be quite high, but you'll have variability. That's how you'll know it's not burst suppression. It looks like burst suppression, but it's normal for those very small babies. And then that cycling, starting somewhere around 32, 34 weeks, it gets really nice and robust. But even earlier, you may see, even in the late 20s or in early 30s, as far as the weeks of gestation, corrected age, you'll begin to see some cycling, just some hints of it at the baseline where that variability becomes a little more pronounced at the baseline. And then we're always on the lookout for seizures and artifacts so that we can evaluate that and get those removed. But I hope that's helpful, or kind of takes kind of our normal way of looking at aEEG and maybe puts a little bit of a spin on it and makes a few things a little more understandable. So are there any questions about that? You can type them in, or you can unmute yourself. I'm always open to that. Any questions? Okay, it's doing good. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, well, I will just remind you about our next time, if you can believe it, will be November 26th, after Thanksgiving. And then I think the call for December is pretty early, like the 17th or something, but you guys will get emails about that. And then just as a reminder, I want you to all know, especially if you're a nurse out there, but of course this is open to everyone, the ONE conference will be in February 2019 in San Diego at our Kona Kai Resort. So you can get information about that on synapsecare.com. And then for those of you who do hypothermia in your unit, sorry, I just moved this around to the wrong spots. If you do hypothermia, I want to be sure that you know about the new online brain cooling club. And so this is presentations by nurses, physicians, neurologists, developmental specialists from around the globe, and it's online on demand, and it's an ability to get your whole team on the same page around cooling. It's a great way to do your online competencies for the year. If you're in California, this meets your California requirements for cooling education. And if you're a nurse, you can get nursing contact hours. So it is everything you ever wanted to know about caring for babies undergoing cooling. It meets and exceeds the California requirements for education, which is 8 hours. And it is 15 lectures on demand, 12 international experts, 10 contact hours, and 1 focus, all about caring for babies who are undergoing cooling. And you have lifetime access to that. So anyways, I just want to make sure, I talked to a few people at NAN last week who didn't even know about it. So I wanted to make sure that I was telling people about it and welcoming you to join us online. And we do have group discounts. We have alumni discounts if you're part of some of our other courses. So just reach out if you're interested and want to know more about that. But if not, I will see you on November 26th. And if you have any suggestions for topics, just go ahead and email me. I always appreciate that when I get an email asking for me to have a focus, because certainly, you know, I could talk about aEEG all day long. So it's always helpful to know what would be most helpful to you guys. So if there are no final questions, we'll wrap up for this month. And you always know how to find me. So you can find me on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, wherever. You can find me there. Or by email, Kathy@synapsecare.com. Hope you guys have a great day. And I will see you guys next month.